Good afternoon. Welcome to our August Government Relations Update. I'm Michelle McCaughey, Director of Government Relations. And with us this afternoon, we have the Chair of the IRS ETAAC, Electronic Tax Administration Advisory Committee, Jared Ballew, who will be making a presentation about the committee's June report. And when he's not totally consumed in ETAAC, Jared is a 20-year veteran of the tax industry, and he is currently serving as Vice President of Government and Industry Relations at Taxwell, serving both Drake Tax Software and TaxAct. He is also President of the National Association of Computerized Tax Processors, NACTP, a trade association of the top income tax, payroll, and information reporting companies. Also with us is Thad Inge, who is our NAEA's Legislative Counsel, and he is going to moderate the session with Jared. And I'm going to say thank you again and turn the mic over to Thad.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. And I'll be very short because we want to get into Jared's presentation. But I'll just say I'm very excited to have Jared here today because ETAAC is one of those reports that comes out. It's just full of great ideas every year. And I know that we often reference it or refer to it when we're doing our own letters or, talking to the Hill or white papers because everything, is common sense and is exactly what IRS needs to be doing. I think this year is particularly interesting because they actually have money. They've got, I think now it's the $59 billion. And they're saying they're going to be doing a lot of the stuff that you guys are recommending. So, in the past, it's been, oh, these are great ideas, but we can't afford all of that. And so I think you guys are playing an even, more pivotal role, and your timing was very good as chair because of that. But I'll turn it over to you. But just for housekeeping real quick, Jared's got a deck that he's going to run through and kind of give an overview. Folks, please submit your questions in the Q&A portion of the platform. We'll be monitoring the questions. If you have questions that, we'll try to ask them in real time if they're not too many, just to keep this a bit conversational. But we'll also do Q&A at the end. So keep the questions coming. We'll either get them in real time or at the end. And Jared, look forward to hearing from you.
Awesome, Thad. Thank you so much. And Michelle, thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here today with you guys. And I guess, Thad, are you going to share the deck, or is that something that I'm doing? Just
let me see. Michelle, how do you guys want to do that? With the delay, we were kind of rushed here on the housekeeping.
Can you do it, Jared, on your end?
Yeah, let me get to it real quick and I can go ahead and take care of that. So as I get this ready, just a couple of things I'll bring up. So with the ETAAC, Thad, you'd mentioned a couple of items that this year's been kind of historic, right? When we talk about making recommendations to both Congress and IRS. But what's unique about being chair from this past year, 2022 to 2023, is that, we haven't ever had the funds, right? We can make these recommendations, we can try and align what we're doing, but can they actually implement them? And that's always been the challenge, is the answer is no, is that they haven't been able to do that. And so let me just share this real quick, and I think we'll be ready to kind of jump in here. Let's see if you can see this.
Looks good to me. Looks great.
Does that look great to you guys? Okay, so I'll just jump in real quick to my next slide. And that's coming up for you. Who is ETAAC? All right. So what I want to talk about today for those that are online is kind of twofold. I want to talk about who we are, why it's important, right? I want to give just a high-level overview, and then I want to talk about some of the recommendations. And obviously, I want to focus some of my comments today to the audience, right? You are practitioners or enrolled agents, and the role that you play, and how the recommendations are things that you're doing on the Hill currently, and how you can kind of come alongside and partner this association or this advisory committee. So the advisory committee itself, just a little history on it. One of the things that we'd like to tell everyone is that we are unique in that we're a congressional advisory committee. There are other advisory committees on the Hill, but primarily the two that we think in tax are going to be your ETAAC and your ERSAC. ERSAC reports to the commissioner himself, versus ETAAC reports to Congress. However, we're able to make IRS recommendations as well. Our primary goal, or our lanes that we focus in, is going to be electronic tax administration. And we also focus in identity theft and tax refund fraud. So how do we do that? How do we take, kind of that charge of being an advisory committee and not oversight? We all know that IRS has plenty of oversight. You talked about TIGDA, we talk about GAO, and many in Congress themselves. But what our specific goal here is to say, from our experiences as a group, what are some of the advice that we can give them that's practical and that they can implement? And so the way we do this, we actually develop like committee work. So you can join the ETAAC. We put you into different committees and we collaborate. We get to meet in DC about 5 times a year. In the pandemic, we had to meet virtually, but as we moved out of that, it's actually getting to meet at the IRS headquarters at 11/11. We get to do a lot of research. We are covered under some NDAs, or non-disclosure agreements, where we actually get to go behind the scenes, behind the curtains, and ask the questions of the IRS employees and staff that are, developing these products and delivering these services and tools, and kind of get those real answers from them, what's actually going on. And one of the things I always tell my committee members is we come in with ideas of how we think things should be. We get in there and we find out why it can't be done. And it really helps us kind of get a better full picture of how we can improve tax administration. And then obviously, at the end of the year, we do report some of the topic areas. So within ETAAC, and you'll look within our report, as it pertains to you as a practitioner, we focus on budget and security. We focus on technology. And what's fun is that, we have that payroll component, and then we have the income tax component. We have security experts. But ultimately, the committee itself is brought together through 3 primary channels, and that's going to be your state tax administrators. So many of you EAs out there will know you probably worked with the state tax administrator at some point, your state itself, right? And so we get to have those as members. We get to have tax practitioners like yourselves volunteer to be members. And then we have software developers. So those are your software companies that you guys subscribe to and utilize. And so when we pull the 3 together as stakeholders, right, it really begins to unify the voice when we're starting to look at problems and issues that are affecting taxpayers and ultimately administration and policy. We began to kind of really, beat the drum and look at it from all angles, which is really nice, and it helps develop even you as a professional in your perspective on what the IRS should be doing. So with that, I'm flying along here. But what we did this past year was unique. So we started off knowing that there was a potential for the IRA funds to pass. And we said, first, we're a membership or a advisory committee of many stakeholders. Let's first reach out. And so I commissioned my committee to go out, and we sent out stakeholder surveys across all the different stakeholder groups and said, hey, what are your top priorities? What do you see as the most pressing issues that the IRS should be considering fixing first? And so we started collecting that feedback over the first couple of months, and we took those priorities and we began to kind of mash them all together. And then we began to work them from September to November and start to do kind of an alignment of, well, how would we address the issues? Like, what's the main problem here? And what we found was that in tax administration, or whether it's in the news on Capitol Hill or in your backyard or in your community, is that there seems to be a disconnect whenever we start talking about tax policy, right? So we're talking GR here, things that we do on the Hill, things your congressional staff are addressing. And then you go to the far spectrum to taxpayers, and it's voluntary tax compliance, right? What does the actual taxpayer know? What is their perception of what's going on with taxes? Do they even really care about voluntary tax compliance, right? And we found the answer was really, as long as they're getting their refunds or they're not having any disruptions in their yearly filing process, that really isn't any. But in that middle, where someone doesn't take the happy path, when someone has an issue, what's going on? How do we fix it? How do we diagnose those issues? And we came up with what we call the taxpayer trust model. And this taxpayer trust model, go back. The taxpayer trust model is an idea, right? Whenever there's a problem, we need to start first and understand that policy starts at Congress. But once the congressional staff writes it, it's in long bills. It's hard to read. It's hard to understand and digest. And we as practitioners a lot of times go through, we try and come through it ourselves and understand it, make sense of it. But ultimately, the IRS has to go through first. And we said, IRS, you need to provide timely guidance. You need to provide timely communication and education. If the IRS can't take the legislation that's been passed by Congress or Treasury and produce the guidance, communication, education, then we as practitioners and software companies, we can't deliver products to our customers, right? We begin to guess, or we have to kind of fill in the gap or fill in the space. And that's where returns begin to be filed wrong. We see issues, we see letters start being issued. And again, that's kind of the snowball effect that we see. Now, beyond just the foundation that we think is important, and again, this is important because it builds to our recommendations, is that there's service delivery channels. And that's how we deliver services to taxpayers in your office, whether you're a practitioner or a software company or even the government. You know, we hear a lot in the news, especially when you're talking on Capitol Hill or even from the commissioner himself, say, you know, taxpayers need choice, taxpayers need choice, taxpayers need choice. And fundamentally, we agree as an ETAAC, you know, taxpayers do need choice and filing options. But if you only focus on choice, right, then you're missing the other three primary pillars that hold up the taxpayer's trust for them to voluntarily comply. And so you have to provide access to these tools and services. You have to be transparent in how you're dealing with the taxpayer. You have to provide security, and so the taxpayer feels secure when they're transacting with you, that their information is not being used, misused, or stolen. So again, all those things have to come together and hold up the taxpayer's trust. And when the taxpayer trusts the system, they have confidence in the system, we believe it ultimately promotes voluntary tax compliance. And so this model right here, when I talk about it, and you're going to see it in a second, what does that translate to? Well, a lot of people call that the tax gap, right? We heard this thing called, well, how do you fix the tax gap? What do you do for the tax gap? Well, a lot of the issues we find with non-compliance or this tax gap probably fall with where you violated either a foundational piece or one of the pillars that hold up the taxpayer trust. And so we feel like this model was something we wanted to start with, that when we start taking our recommendations and we started putting together, like, how are we going to flow out our report? We began running each recommendation or idea. Every one that we had on the table, we had almost 100. We began to run them through this model. Does this provide guidance, communication, education? Does it support all of these channels? And ultimately, it is a truth test of, will the recommendation withstand as helping the tax administrative system deliver voluntary compliance? So again, we are the administrators between voluntary compliance and policy, and this is the mechanism and the tool we use, whether you know it or not, to deliver those services as a practitioner or software provider. So I'll stop there. There's a lot to unpack.
No, that's great. Quick question: is this something that ETAAC has always used from the beginning, or is this a newer thing that you guys put in place?
Great question. No, this is brand new. So we've never used this model. It's generally in the past, for the last 3 years I have been on the committee, you know, it's just been a matter of us bringing up ideas and throwing them out and then stitching them together post. This year, we just kind of went at it a different way. We said, you know, we want to be able to truly put out recommendations that we think can be implemented and that are looked at from a holistic approach. So it's something new, you know, and I'm encouraging the next ETAAC as well. We feel like this is a foundation where we can begin to use this as a test, and you can in your practice as well, right? Not just in ETAAC. We're really trying to push this out there. Why are taxpayers not coming to my office, or why am I having issues? Well, you as a practitioner, are you doing these things? Are you offering these services? So again, it's more than just, you know, for an ETAAC. It's good for Congress, it's good for IRS, it's good for practitioners, software companies to really hold what they're doing, and as they're trying to grow their businesses or grow their practices or grow their services, to kind of run their business through this model. So it's a great question, Thad. This is brand new.
No, I think it's great, and I think IRS might want to steal it from you guys, and because it's impressive.
Yeah, so we're really excited about that. Now I'm going to move on. What I wanted to talk about, and the reason I want to jump into this is, you know, so we had the IRA funding that passed on the Hill this past year, which gave the IRS historic $80 billion, right? As ETAAC, some of our back histories, we work with the IRS to get generally their strategic operating plans, their roadmaps, their IT modernization efforts. All of those things have changed, right? We had the Taxpayer First Act and the Taxpayer First Act initiatives and roadmaps and plans. And so there's half dozen or so plans at the IRS. There have been over the last couple of years with priorities of projects. I think we came across well over 500 initiatives or projects the IRS was trying to do at one time during our research. And so as a group, we're trying to pull together all these things. Well, fortunately, But the funding, they did come out with a strategic operating plan, right, which really consolidated a lot of their efforts, a lot of these fringe plans or business operating unit plans, and they put it into a pretty nice document for us. So what we wanted to do is, after we kind of filtered what was a good idea, we then structured it along the taxpayer journey. So this report that you would look at that we've done this year came away with 26 recommendations. The way we structured it is along the taxpayer's journey, because ultimately the taxpayer's journey begins, as we know as practitioners, right? It's going to happen whenever they're doing their information reporting, when they start a new business, when they're doing their payroll, their estimates. All of that stuff happens before the filing that we think of as traditional income tax journey, right? And so as you go through the 26 recommendations, you'll see that we start with information reporting, or we take that back. We actually start with some of the core fundamental interactive IRS sites and tools. And then we jump around to information reporting, we jump into their filing journey experience. And then we end with, what's kind of the modernization effort. And we tie each of these back to a strategic operating plan. So the first one, I'm just going to jump in real quick to, is when we talk about improving services. I think that's kind of a no-brainer for us as practitioners, right? How do we improve services? And just to give you kind of a high-level overview of some of those recommendations, I kind of just pulled them out of order. And how do they apply? Some of these have multiple implications, but what we saw was that, the IRS should prioritize allocating funds to their modernization on their website first, right? So when we start talking about that foundation of guidance, education, communication, their search engine, going to the irs.gov website, is a disaster for any taxpayer, even professionals trying to find what you need to get to. And so if you can create a place where it's actually useful and helpful and easy to navigate, I think that goes a long way to be able to start at the foundation, fix the foundation first, and then start working on your columns and structure. So that's really where the kind of first 1, 2, 3 recommendations came from. Number 3 that I will say is the online account. You guys have seen this. They've already taken some steps in our recommendations for anything with online accounts, and I'll mention that today. We think that that's probably, if you spend your money or spend your resources, it's probably the quickest win. Getting taxpayers their accounts, we saw it through the pandemic, was a win, but ultimately our approach is that tax pros, they need to spend equal amount of time on the tax pro account. It's a force multiplier, right? And I testified to Congress on this as well. We understand you can spend tons of marketing dollars to get an individual taxpayer, but if you can create the services for the tax pros, where they can help the taxpayers create their account and also transact back and forth so that you can get information and they can give it to the tax pros through their online account, and really leverage the professionals who use it day in and day out, right? They're in tax day in and day out. So that was one of our recommendations as well, is really give the tax pros more features, tie more integration to that tax pro account. And then we jump right into talking about modernization, 9-4X filings. We talk about, what you can do there. And we've already seen the IRS this year talking about their 940 filings and how they're going to be modernizing it, allowing some more electronic options with it. So again, the IRS is making some really quick strides with it. I'll move on a little bit more, and I know I'm rushing here because I want.
Yeah, can I ask about 2 of those real quick?
Yeah, I'll go back.
Just because the 940 and the 941, and obviously the amended. Yeah. Of course, the 941X became more prominent with the whole ERTC, where everyone was having to go back and amend it. There's not an electronic option as of now. You have to do a paper process. But just in general, and this is something ETAAC has sort of covered for a number of years, when you look at electronic filing, the individual side, since the Restructuring Act passed, they've done a really good job of getting that up over 90%. Yeah. But when you look at the business side, and especially 940s and 941s, it's still, I think now it's getting close to 60%, but it was always somewhere between 45 and yeah. It was low. In the 40s. Exactly. And that, I think, sort of COVID highlighted that. Yeah. And even during all of that, the IRS, sort of the messaging out of IRS was, some people would say, yeah, we're going to fix that, but some would say it's hard, or it's going to take years, especially on, an electronic option for 941X. And then I know, recently, and they sort of reiterated this in the paperless processing initiative they came out with 2 weeks ago, that They said we're going to have it done by next year, which is, I think music to the ears for a lot of people, but just curious if you think that's realistic, and And if you have any further thoughts on that.
Well, you know, the 940 series were kind of the redheaded stepchild. We all know that. They don't garner the news with Congress or funds or things like that. You know, and when you think about this paper backlog, you know, everything that got reported, generally they were only talking about individual or business returns, right? They weren't even mentioning, but the problem was the bulk was 940 returns. That's what was sinking their ship, right? If you could fix 940s, then they could handle the individuals. But the problem to even fix it further is, you know, everyone knows, you guys know this, the reporting agents, right? It's a complicated mess to even file and become one. And it just, when the answer is it's easier just to send it in on mail than do something digitally, electronically, there's your problem, right? There's your root cause, not just addressing paper. And I think that's one of the things ETAAC was trying to say here is, you know, we can tell you how to scan, we can tell you how to ingest paper better, great. But ultimately, you need to address the root cause. And it has to be easier to be able to file and handle from a professional standpoint your customers' 940s. And when paper is ultimately easier, you're never going to get someone or convince someone to stop doing it or to stop sending it. And you're never going to fix the problem. So yeah, I think that was one of our big conversations is, yeah, it's a paper driver, but you have to do something to make the process easier so that you drive adoption from the practitioner. So yeah, no, great point.
And then second one on recommendation number 12, we did get a few questions on this one just because obviously tax pro accounts is huge for NAEA and, you know, everyone in this profession.
Yeah.
But number 12 was one of a few that kind of stood out to folks about this. You know, if tax pros could utilize this and, you know, pull these and deliver them to third parties,
Sure.
that would be extremely helpful. Is there any other color that you can share around that one?
Absolutely. So one of the challenges in this is technological, right? When we talk about sharing this information, like getting your source documents, whether it be 1099s, primarily 1099s, sooner, faster, but more than that is the IRS isn't sharing it with allowing it to come out to practitioners, which would be great if we could get that obviously an online account, but they're not even sharing it with state departments of revenue. And so what we were seeing across the board here is that it became kind of useless. A lot of that wasn't coming out or being made available. It wasn't in transcripts. You know, so you couldn't pull it there. States couldn't use it to help identify fraud or inaccuracies until late April, May, June, right? And so for that one, it's a matter of a technology investment and a commitment on the IRS to say, one, can we do the technology investment? Two, is there privacy concerns, like being able to release that data, share that data, and how do we do that securely? And so it's kind of a complicated, it seems like a no-brainer and a really easy one on the nose, but it's kind of twofold. One, can they get the technology to ingest it quickly? We say yes, we think so because they do own that process, right? Instead of the W-2, which comes from SSA. But then sharing it, how do you share it? How do you get to people? Because it's about sending data out. Once you take the data and you start sending it out of the IRS, that's where the real problems begin to arise, right? And so that's some of the things that we addressed in our recommendation. We think there's a possibility to do it. We believe we have a good solution using the online account and the authentication mechanisms and leveraging professionals. So it's coming. I think that one's probably more complicated than it seems, but I think they're looking at it and it's a real possibility. And some of that's going to be legislation too. If you're talking about 1099, some of that has to be legislated for the date and timeline to move up. So again, there's that kind of third piece too.
Great. That's very helpful.
Yep. And just kind of moving on, like I said, stop me at any time. One of the things that we saw is transparency, right? So when there's problems or when there are issues or even when there's not, right? We've seen a general lack of transparency in there. So maybe their delays, their backlogs, where information's at. A good example of a public dashboard, what we made a recommendation to was California. If you've ever looked at the California Franchise Tax Board, they have a very good public-facing dashboard that says, you know, you call in, here's the wait times, you're processing returns, here's the delays here, refunds are coming back here, and it's updated publicly so legislators can see it, software developers, taxpayers, everyone can see what the status is or the health of the State Department of Revenue of California is. And so we kind of pushed that and said, if you provide more transparency in what you're doing, you'll probably reduce the amount of support calls, the support questions. You might get a little more grace, might not, you know, but we think that California had great success with it. We've seen some other states with great success using dashboards. that was a big one, talking about transparency. When we talk about some of these other things like third-party designee, you know, one of the members, I think he's on the call today, Jerry Gaddis, he was on our ETAAC, and he was instrumental in writing, along with another one of our practitioners, this recommendation, right? The third-party designee is a big one. Right now, what we see is that you may have a third-party designee, but it expires upon the return basic acceptance, right? They call that a complete. The return's completed and your third party expires. However, there's other rules and regulations where what happens if the IRS accepts it, but they sideline it and a letter comes out and it's being issued. Well, now your third party has no, well, it's not valid, doesn't really help you anymore, even though the rules say you have a year, right? And so there's some policy issues that we encourage the IRS to start looking at. We don't believe it would even take regulatory change or congressional change. It's simply just like an internal policy of recognizing the third-party designee on behalf of your customers. You know, there's some other things we talked about there, 8821 filings, which is pretty cool. You know, we do 2848s, but is there a way to streamline 8821 filings? Is there a way that you can tie that into the electronic return? And so that's still to be fleshed out. We think that this recommendation is just kind of the first step. I think this next year you're going to see more around this third-party designee issue and how we can allow practitioners who have already gotten the authority from their taxpayer, who've already got the consent, they're already got the juror signature down on the 1040, really empowering them and the taxpayer's choice, right? So taxpayers have said, I want to work through a practitioner, respecting that process when an issue arises, and being able to at least notify the practitioner that something's going on, and a letter being issued or being sent to the practitioner, things like that. So again, it's all around the taxpayer choice through transparency, access, you name it, and security for that matter.
And probably not surprising to you, this is a big priority for NAEA. You know, we hear about these issues around power of attorneys and 8821s all the time, and right. Sort of, you know, the need to kind of revamp the whole process or at least you know, speed it up and make them last longer and more efficiently.
I mean, cap issues in there, you know, we've heard the same thing, right? Yep. You know, trying to apply for it, you've never done it before, and it's
No, we've got some task force that are, you know, working on that or trying to put ideas around that. But we were excited to see this in ETAAC because you know, it's one of our top priorities for sure.
Yeah, I'll say, you know, it's definitely not, like I said, it's something that we're going to continue to work on. So if you have interest from NAEA and there's something you want to collaborate, I think in this next year with ETAAC, I'm sure that they would love to hear your ideas, because ultimately, right, these things do make it to Congress, and it helps and it does give weight. So if there's ways that we can listen to you and hear some of your ideas, we'd happy to poach a good idea for our report ourselves. But yeah, that sounds
great. Sounds great.
You know, we did a couple other recommendations around funding and prioritization. One of the things everyone's talked about direct file, no one really wants to talk about it too much. Our whole thing was, if you have now $60 billion and you have a lot of modernization and a lot of efforts going into it, we want to make sure that they're thinking through the spending, make sure you're prioritizing things right. That was really what 18 was about. And then things like VITA and TCE, you know, there's a lot of great opportunities there for these clinics to grow. We've seen some really good successes in the recent years. So we made some recommendations there just around services to taxpayers and some of the grant programs that you could grow pretty easily and it to be a good spend of the money. So those are kind of the recommendations here. I want to move on because I only got to one. We'll move on to two here. When we talk about quickly resolving taxpayer issues, this one, it's a sticky one, right? One of the things that we did is we recommended a couple of things. One is authenticating third parties to be able to pull information in. This is kind of that second part to it. And this is where you pull in your online accounts. We understand the IRS is going through some interesting times right now where, you know, used to have the IRS account they used through Secure Access. Now they only have ID.me. They are looking at other providers, but ultimately, how do we secure that information so that we can have a trusted third party? Does that look like an API? Or what that means is, does it look like an automated program where you can pull data down, not even just your online account, but is there a future where it pulls into your software, or a report that you can download from your pro account and import it into your software? You know, what does that look like and how do you do that securely? A couple other things that I'll just kind of highlight here that we thought were really good, and Thad, feel free to stop me if there's one in here in particular that interests you. regulating paid preparers, right? We met with the Hill on this. Actually, we did some mid-year reports. We actually met with a couple of congressmen about their thoughts on this. You know, with the Levin case and everything else, where we've looked at the appetite for practitioner regulation, and ultimately we landed on, you know, we think it's a good thing for the tax industry to have some sort of regulation, some sort of education. We believe the IRS has the ability to do more on the education front versus having a set, you know, pass a test and you're done forever. We think that we probably should look more on the continuing education for security, for credential. You know, if you want to get a credential, great, but ultimately there are many ways. We have a lot of ideas. Jerry, he's on here today. He had some ideas on how we can do that. A lot of our practitioners did, but for the most part, we support, you know, tax pro regulation to some extent, leveraging their current tax forms. Right, they already have the P10. They're regulating the P10 to an extent. They track credits. You guys report to the IRS the, you know, continuing education credits, and so the system's already built. It's already there, and we think that, you know, it could be a pretty easy lift if you make it an education thing and not necessarily a pass and new credential thing. You might be able to get around the Levin case. So we'll see if there's traction there. It still may take a congressional action. I think it probably will for the IRS to actually move on this, but that's why we put it out there to say that we still support it. And do I think this is going to move in the next year? Probably not. I think there's a lot of the priorities on the Hill. In fact, you may have your own weight on this. Going into an election year, practitioner regulation probably isn't an appetite they're looking to satisfy. But I think that in the coming years, as privacy concerns go up, we've seen a lot of big tech and data. I think that that's going to be a natural progression, and ultimately we're going to drive towards some sort of regulation. So although I think it's in a 1 year time frame, probably not, just due to elections and other priorities. But I think ultimately the IRS is looking at it. I think Congress is looking at it, and I just think that the climate is driving towards it.
Yep. No, I would agree with all that, and it's a big, you know, been a big priority for ours for a long time. And we lost a few of our champions, unfortunately, with Senator Portman and
Right.
Congressman Tom Rice were two of the sponsors that we had. But I know Congressman Panetta is looking to reintroduce his bill and is kind of working with co-sponsors right now. And, you know, when we've talked to offices about some sort of minimum standard, and we try to, you know, stress that it would be a minimum standard, it's not heavy-handed regulation.
Right.
You know, there is so much in the news, going back to the ERTC, there's so much in the news about ERTC fraud, or, you know, other things that happened during COVID where people took advantage of the system or maybe didn't have good representation. And when you speak of it in that way, people do kind of get it, you know. But I think it's always hard to try to, you know, propose new regulation for an industry, because some people are just, you know, it's not their top priority. But yeah, we are hopeful and keep pushing, because we think it would enhance the industry, but also be very helpful to taxpayers. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And we're supportive of that. So again, it made it in the recommendations just because we're going to continue hammering on it.
No, we appreciate it.
As our stakeholders and partners are also doing. So I think it's a collaborative effort, and we'll get there. I'm going to, just for sake of time, I'm probably going to keep moving on past some of these just so we can get in and maybe do some more questions. The third one was talking about the tax gap. And I'm going to move into the tax gap. Again, this is the IRS priority here. The tax gap, as I explained before, is many different things. As a tax administrator, as a tax practitioner yourself or stakeholder, understand pretty much every recommendation we're making, we believe in some way, shape, or form addresses the tax gap, because it's making a system that's easier, more friendly to use, and therefore reduces the friction in some places to promote voluntary tax compliance or more accurate tax returns. Most taxpayers, in my opinion, and as with practitioners, want to get it right. They want to do it right. Again, lack of guidance, education, communication at the very beginning can be detrimental in these small businesses being able to file returns that are accurate, or people going out and doing it themselves and filing it's accurate, and software being able to project things accurately, right? And so everything addresses the tax gap to a point. But these three recommendations here, you know, we're talking about the 1099-K educational materials. We're going to see that this year. We think it's probably one of the most critical things that could affect the tax gap coming up, how people comply, and and how they are educated on what they need to do, practitioners, how we can apply it. It's probably going to be one of the biggest things as far as that affects tax gap in the short term. There's some other things here with the non-resident aliens, but identity theft and tax refund fraud was a big one for us when we're talking about the tax gap. There are people that are tax cheats. There are criminals out there that affect the gap as well, that are stealing credits. We've seen motor fuel credits that are a big issue that are out there. We've seen the ERC stuff out there, and ultimately some of that is affecting the gap. And so how do we address those? Can we get some low-hanging fruit first without having to swallow the whole elephant? What are some of the bites that we can take? So quickly, tax gap, those were kind of the three main hitters that we think that could reduce it. And that I'll stop there if you have one, but I'll move on if not.
No, I think we're good. And I think maybe in a few minutes we'll bring in Jerry as well, because I know that he partnered with you on some of this stuff. So
yeah, sure.
I'll just put him on notice if he's willing to do that.
Sure. All right. So objective number 4, when we're talking about objectives and delivering cutting edge technology. So there's a couple of things that we noticed when we began to kind of dig into their IT modernization plan and their roadmap for delivering service. Delivering the 1099 and NEC data to states on an expedited basis. Why is that important? Being able to get that data to the states actually helps them prevent fraud. Again, kind of like the other 1099s, they're not getting it till like April, May, and that doesn't help things. So that's kind of a state recommendation there. But ultimately, in implementing technology that's not lift and shift. And what do I mean by that? So we all know that our technology is dated, right? A lot of times you can buy a new platform, you spend millions, billions of dollars on the Ferrari, right? And then all of a sudden you take out the Ferrari engine, you say, well, our old engine worked just fine. Let's set this, old Oldsmobile engine in this new Ferrari that we just purchased. Leaking oil, right? Doesn't run well, isn't meant to be with that car. That's what we're saying. It's like, if you're going to build a new system, you need to make sure that whatever you do, you use it forward looking, and you're not just taking the old system and just putting a new paint job on the outside. That's what we mean by not doing lift and shift. And the biggest one here, and I think this is what I would like to kind of push on you guys, is NAEA and get this message out. When we talk about platforms with the IRS, and you talk about the archaic systems, the COBOL, the old ways, it's actually recommendation 23. It's called the general master file. Everyone seems to think about IMF or individual master file. They think about, modernized e-file. Those are actually not, those are just the intake methods, and those are actually working very well. They're very flexible. While they're considered legacy models, the underlying technology of those is very flexible and very robust, and can go for years to come. It's Backly, the general master file is like where it's the collection, right? It's what collects all the peripheral data, and that is what's aging. And so being very clear, and when we make recommendations about technology that needs to be updated, it's the general master file. That's what people should be really focusing on wherever you're at. Because what happens is, think of it as like a checkout, like a library, right? The general master file has one data source, and when you check out a piece, no one else gets it, right? And so what they end up doing is making composites or copies of this data. When you think about where's my refund, when you think about all these other tools, well, they're having to take snapshots of data at that time, and they pull it out over here. You're not reading live data, you're reading a snapshot in that date and time. When their service agents are trying to look at return information for you, they're taking snapshots. No one's getting to read this like a dynamic database, right? You're reading snapshots or composites of this general master file, which is why they can't communicate, which is why you can't have a lot of these integrated services that would make our lives all wonderful for practitioners or taxpayers. Again, so one of the things that we wanted to get out there is that we've seen a lot of confusion on old technology. Ultimately, I think if you name it, and if we continue to name it, that it's the general master file, that it will help kind of put that hyper focus on this is what we need to see modernized. This is the core root problem. And if you can modernize this, you begin to free up all the back-end services. You can begin to send information internally, right? You can make your internal services better, which ultimately will allow them to create external services that we will integrate with as professionals or stakeholders. So that's something we wanted to make sure we got out.
Jared, we've got a couple of questions. Maybe they might not be exactly on point, but I'll go ahead and ask them just so we can make sure we address them.
Sure.
One is, while W-2 are uploaded to IRS and are available in transcripts, it would be awesome if they could import to the state withholding as well. Some taxpayers do not always receive all of the W-2s.
Yeah.
And then when we try to help taxpayers become compliant with their filings, something to think about in upcoming tax years. Possible? Question mark, question mark. Did you follow that?
Yeah, no, I get it. We agree. I don't think, I think it's a matter of the old system right now just doesn't track it, right? It just doesn't take it in. There's not a field for it to hold it. We 100% agree. ETAAC's on with you. I think any way we can take that information and then it can be portable, right? We want digital and portable so that the taxpayer's choice, it can be imported back into the taxpayer's choice, whether it's a professional software or DIY or, God forbid, paper file. But they could choose to use that data. And we all know taxpayers aren't the greatest at keeping track of information, or sometimes don't even get it from their provider. There's tons of reasons why things are inaccurate or you don't get it. So if you could get it from the source, yeah, again, that closes the tax gap as well and makes the whole experience better, reduces letters, reduces phone calls, and how many times your customers have to come in and visit you. So yeah, it's good all around. Great recommendation.
And then one question, I mean, this is sort of gets to probably the discussion we'll have at the end as well. But Dave Tallis said, this is a very long list. What's the likelihood that any of these recommendations will be adopted?
Yeah.
And I'll preface it by, when I saw the paperless processing initiative announced, 2 weeks ago, that was also a very long list, which I think was in probably a lot of overlap. And it was exciting to see, and I wasn't surprised because I knew Werfel wasn't going to go in there and do nothing. I mean, that was his goal, was to go in there and shake things up.
Yeah.
But also wondered, if they would be able to pull that off. I hope they can. But what are your thoughts on?
So that's a great question. We've already seen multiple recommendations lined up to be implemented. The scanning is one of those. So we talked about the document upload tool. Many of you probably had experience with that this past year, talking about letters where if the return got pulled and a letter got issued, some customers or taxpayers were offered an opportunity to resolve that by using a document or the DUT, document upload tool. They're expanding that so that customers don't have to mail it in. That's part of some of the work we did on ETAAC during our real-time feedback with them. So ultimately, when I start talking about recommendations, and this is a pretty rough statistic, but I believe we did this, and Jerry could probably check me on this if I misspeak, but it's close to probably about 60% of the recommendations that we make do end up getting implemented, which is for us is a fantastic thing. So 26 recommendations, we're getting a lot of it. Now, why do we make so many recommendations? That's the other part, right? So everyone looks at this list and like, man, it's long. Well, here's the problem. So if I go make a recommendation, a lot of these probably are cross-connected, and you could probably condense them into 10. I could probably put 26 recommendations into 10. But the problem is when you do that, a lot of times the IRS will pass or fail the recommendation as a bundle. So they say, well, I could do half of this. Well, you said do all of this in a recommendation, right? And so then it's gone. You lose it. And so what we really tried to strategically do is like break this into bite-sized chunks that if they could do the bite size, ultimately we get the whole. And so that was kind of the idea behind it. While there are some cross collaboration, ultimately it's how do we actually deliver it? It's a strategic thing. How do we deliver it in a way that the IRS can adopt it? And we get a higher success rate on adoption. Does that answer your question?
Yep, I think so. Okay. And and I would also go back to, as you alluded to, they've got more funds than they've ever had. Yeah. And so, they need direction on how to spend those or input from, various stakeholders. Yeah. And so there's never been a better time to make a lot of recommendations on how to update technology because the chance of getting it done is a lot, more probable now, I think.
Yeah, and leave it to us tax people to, divide out the columns. All right, so it's not, 1 billion ask. It's, these little couple $1 million asks, right? Just do those. While it adds up to the $1 billion ask, it's just palatable. The different business units, because different business units are allocated different funds, and it just makes it easier.
Yeah,
being creative, trying to.
All right. Yeah, I think you've got a few more slides, right? And then I know they were trying to get, I think Jerry wasn't a panelist, so they were trying to get him on as a panelist, but
Sure. Yeah, I'll just hit this last highlight real quick, and then we can go to, question and answer, whatever you'd like to do. But really, we were talking about attracting and retaining skilled workers. So we talked about, the strategic operating plan and how we talk about technology. We talk about funding, Congress, things like that. But ultimately, what we know is that, you've got to be able to have a stability when you're talking about the actual employees. And in the pandemic, something that happened, it's not just the IRS, right? It's all of us. How do you get people to work for you that have had the opportunity to work remotely? How do you be competitive with some of the largest tech companies in the world, right? Your Googles, your Amazons. How do you compete with those and the benefits and all of that? How does IRS actually compete? And they were kind of hamstrung. They still a little bit are because of the GS pay scale that they're on. It's really out of their hands. It's a federal pay scale. They all have to go through USA Jobs. We were seeing about 6 to 9 months from the time a person applied for a federal job till the time they could get onboarded. Well, in this digital age and world, most people aren't going to wait 6 to 9 months for that job, right? If they're really looking for something, they can probably pick something up very fast. So even if they had the correct pay scale, pay band, they just couldn't get them on fast enough. And so one of the things that we said is, making sure that when you use this funds, making sure that you have prioritized a direct hire authority is what they call it, so that you can actually go to these job fairs. They can host them. As the people at the job fairs, they can make the offer right then and there to those employees. They don't have to go through this long process. And then streamline critical pay, which is for your high-end programmers or developers, your critical people, that you can go in and you can match the amount of money that they would probably get in a private industry. And so by pairing those two together, you can begin to at least revolutionize the technical aspect to be able to deliver the modernization. And then we talked about, the 24 probably here is human capital strategies for attrition. They're having to overhire right now. Basically, the IRS said this: if we don't get funded, even in our normal operating capital budget, right? They'll hire. If they don't get their funding, they go to a continuing resolution, which means they have to operate at 80% of their previous year's budget. The first people they cut in that is customer service. So the customer service agents, while they can hire them on, they had to do this bridge little thing with their employment that says, if we don't get funded, your job gets cut. You're gone. You're the first to go. And so therefore they lose it. So their attrition is high anyway. Plus, if you get a continuing resolution, not even under this IRA funding, right? This is just their normal operating budget, then you're going to lose customer service agents. So at least being stable in your year-end budget, marked for inflation, it gives the IRS predictability in the service level, which is what we all have to interact with. And so those are some of our recommendations. We thought about and said, is there, and everyone hates to hear this, but are there ways to get around the pay scale, like having the 6 to 9 month spin up? Could you use contractors? And if you paid a contractor and you just use this pool of money, the contractors don't have to go through the same rigmarole. Granted, you could do vetting, but is there a way to get there? The answer to that was kind of no, because of the requirement for training. Understanding the IRS actually has I think it's a 12 to 16 week training process. So even once you go through the long hiring process, then the training process before they get to the floor for customer services there too. So there's a lot of complicated answers there, but ultimately stability and funding improves service. So
we agree with that. And you're preaching to the choir, because these are issues we've all raised as well. Jerry, I see you're there. How are you?
Sure.
So I'd love to hear your perspective on bringing the EA perspective to ETAAC. Obviously, there's lots of tax professionals, but you kind of have that unique EA role on ETAAC, and would love to hear sort of how that, your perspective on that.
Sure, thanks. First of all, I'd like to say that what you see with Jared is what you get. The guy's like this all the time. He's incredibly energetic, enthusiastic, passionate, and his knowledge runs both deep and wide. So it's been great working with Jared and a really talented group of people. One of the things we talked about is that Jared made it very clear that I'm on the committee as me. I'm not on the committee representing NAEA, but since I've been involved with NAEA for so long, I tend to agree with just about everything NAEA stands for and writes about. So I feel comfortable presenting those things as my own ideas when they are consistent with NAEA's. I don't know, Jared, did you get a chance to talk about the membership balance plan and recruiting for NAEA?
That was my closing comment. So I'm gonna let you do it. Go for it. Recruit.
So ETAAC is a 3-year appointment. So we're looking for new people every year. And there is a membership balance plan that talks about the different points of view that should be represented on ETAAC. And one of those is the practitioner. And I think we do need more practitioners, and it's helpful to have practitioners in the room. One of the things I've noticed is that IRS is good at rolling out direct-to-consumer solutions. And the practitioners are going, hang on a second, hang on. Half the returns are filed by us. You know, let us help you. For example, one of the things we talked about was improving the service for the IRS with the calls. And people are focused on answering more calls and hiring more people. And one of the things we talked about was if there's 250,000 tax professionals out there, and each of us can take 4 calls away from the IRS, you know, that's 100,000 fewer calls coming in, and that makes the metrics look good. So I think it is important to have the practitioners recognized. And I love that I have such a great network of tax professionals and you guys at NAEA that meet with the conferences and talk about offline the things that are challenging you, the things that you run across that keep you from being successful in helping your clients. I think as tax practitioners, we tend to focus on tax policy and what Congress is doing. But I think where we often get tripped up in our own practices is trying to make them happen. Like the black hole that is the CAF unit. Like there's got to be an electronic answer to that. So it's been a great experience for me. I've learned so much the first year I've been on. I'm excited about doing 2 more years. And I would encourage other people that are interested in tax administration to apply for some of these things. I know we've had a number of people serve on, what's the other one?
ERSAC.
ERSAC. Yeah, we've had a number of people do that, and even had some people chair that. I think that's been helpful, but the electronic stuff is really interesting as well. Yeah. And working on how to make the IRS more efficient, how to do things electronically is pretty fun. And as Jared and Thad both mentioned, there's no better time to be making recommendations because the IRS has money to spend.
Yeah,
so
and just to let you know and Jerry, just to add on to that. So our open applications start December to January. So be on the lookout coming this December. If it's something that interests you, we'd love to have you apply. So December to January. And one of the things, I travel across the country. I do speeches all over the place, various topics, you name it. I'm going to be at the IRS tax forums for the rest of the year. So if you see me, come see me, come say hi. I have those conversations that tax practitioners are superheroes. It's hands down. We as practitioners are superheroes, and in fact, actually Superman doesn't even want to be a tax practitioner, right? If you think about it that way, you know why? Because he's afraid of cryptocurrency. So it's true. It's a bad joke, guys. I'm going to end with a bad joke, but it's needed to have your voice. It's important. And associations like the NAEA are invaluable to making sure that both the tax administrators, the policy makers on the Hill hear from you, understand what's going on, and it really does make a difference as a whole in tax administration. So,
well, Jared, I know that one of your predecessors, Courtney K. Decker, then went on to get recruited by the IRS and move in-house. Have they tried to persuade you with their?
I'll never tell. I'll never tell.
Or what about you, Jerry?
Not yet. I don't know that I'm ready to sit on the other side of the table. It would be hard to do after sitting on this side for so long.
Yeah.
But I will tell you that part of what I've learned in my year on ETAAC is how hard it is to work at the IRS. I mean, I feel like they get blamed for everything, much of which Congress did. And when you see exactly how hard it is to do anything at the IRS and how big everything is, just for example, they get beat up consistently about not answering the phones. And part of what I learned this year is because the IRS has the biggest call center in the country. Anytime somebody else needs help, they pull from the IRS. So if there's a FEMA disaster, if FEMA needs to answer phones, the IRS call center gets pulled to go work for FEMA, and then the IRS gets beat up for not answering the phone calls after they were told to give people away. So it's been astounding to learn how big everything is at the IRS, how complicated everything at the IRS is, how many things have to work together. And I've definitely gained a lot more respect for the people on that side of the table, no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Well, Jared, thank you. And Jerry, thanks for pitch hitting here at the end as well. And really appreciate all the work you guys do. I think it's invaluable. And if folks haven't read the report, you know, it's a great read because it's all the things. If IRS did everything that you guys recommended, they would be the most popular, you know, agency in the federal government.
We
I'm
think so.
convinced. But really appreciate it. And Michelle, do you want to say a few closing remarks?
Sure. Jared, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. And Jerry, it's great to see you on screen as well. I just want to thank you all, and we will be having another GR update in the fall. So we look forward to seeing you in a couple of months for that one. Thanks again.
And thanks everyone that stuck in till the end. I know that we had a little delay there, so I appreciate the flexibility and for folks sticking with it.
Thanks all.
All right,
Thank
thanks
you.
everyone.
Bye.